Today, I'm kind of get into the background, talking about the Reformation overall. Of course, I'll first talk about the background of the Reformation. Then we'll of course get into and discuss who Martin Luther was and all that. So yeah, that's the first question I usually ask. Like, what was the Reformation? What was really the Protestant Reformation more than anything? Well, it was a religious schism that occurred, of course, starting in the 16th century in the Catholic Church. Saw how it broke, basically Christianity into two main sects. You get Catholic and Protestant. They already have Orthodox, which is more in Eastern Europe and all that. But you got basically these two different, religious sects that kind of break away from each other. And so you get these new religions that kind of come about, such as, we'll get into Lutheranism first, Calvinism, Presbyterianism, Anglicanism. So all these new kinds of forms of religion of Christianity kind of break away from the Catholic Church. And so you get this division throughout Europe. It starts in the 16th century, although it kind of goes back, they think, to the late Middle Ages, and it covers up to the time of like around the 30 Years' War. So really from about maybe 1517, when Luther posts his 95 Theses, up to like the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. So I'll talk about the Reformation and get more into and talk about like the causes of it, and of course all of that. Here's kind of a slide showing you the Reformation right here. So you can see it was primarily started by this man named Martin Luther. We'll talk about him more who was a German monk or priest around where Saxony, Germany is, and within the Holy Roman Empire. And so he's the figure that really starts the Reformation. But they do think that the Reformation, the causes of it, go back before Martin Luther came along. So I'll get into first kind of talk about what were some of the causes of the Reformation. There's a lot of them. You can really have a list of things that truthfully that they think caused maybe the Reformation later. Luther, I know when he went to Rome, saw how a lot of the clergy were living in luxury. So that's something he kind of saw, especially like in Rome. And so that was one maybe cause of it. People, kind of like the poor people, were kind of disconnected with the Catholic Church, especially like in Europe, like Germany, as an example. Be aware, basically in Europe, a lot of people were disconnected. The poor people were kind of not happy with basically what was going on with the Reformation and all that. And anyway, there was a case where you had clergy were secretly married, or they had mistresses and things like that, where they weren't celibate, etc. You had clergy that were illiterate as well. There was also a case of lay investiture, which had been a big problem as well within the church. And you had this deal where monarchs were actually appointing clergy to office. I know the Catholic Church tried to stop that, etc. Simony was also another problem. Simony was the buying and selling of church offices. There was even the so-called papal schism you may have heard of, where the Catholic Church split and had two popes, one in France and one in Italy. So yeah, different things like that kind of going on within the church, causing these different corrupt issues that later led to Luther coming in. Then there was the thing that they always talk about. That's really the most famous thing, of course, that they think set off, Martin Luther, who you're looking at right here. Martin Luther, of course, was a very famous figure within the Reformation. In fact, in the last 1,000 years, I think Luther was like one of the top 5 most famous individuals in history. He changed history quite a lot because some of the things that he did overall. Luther was originally not supposed to be in the church. I think he studied law originally. Was going to be a lawyer. However, he and a friend were supposedly in a storm or something like that, and they got struck by lightning. And so Luther decided to join the church. And so over time, Luther became this Augustinian monk within the church. And he got several degrees. I think at one point he had a PhD in theology. And at the time when the Reformation started, he was actually a professor at the University of Wittenberg, which is in Saxony, Germany, within the Holy Roman Empire, which is what they called Germany back in those days. Anyway, what happened was Luther was angry about the fact that the church was practicing this thing called indulgences, where people could get their sins forgiven or whatever, and so he decided to do something about it. And there was apparently this preacher going around named Johann Tetzel. And Tetzel was selling indulgences at the time. And apparently, what was going on was that the Catholic Church was building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And so they were trying to basically raise a lot of money for this construction. And so I guess throughout the parishes in Germany, he was selling a lot of these. And so Luther was influenced by Tetzel to eventually write the 95 Theses. And so that's what initially will start the whole Reformation overall. There are other issues too before that. There were some early reformers like Jan Hus, I think, in Bohemia, which is now where the Czech Republic is. And John Wycliffe in England were also figures that I think started some early attempts to reform, but I think Huss was burnt at the stake and Wycliffe died in prison in England. So nothing really happened before Luther comes in and really begins to make these changes. And so this will lead to eventually Luther posting, what becomes known as his 95 Theses, which is like posted like Halloween, I guess the date now for us, October 31st, 1517. It is kind of apocrypha that he actually posted it himself. I think there's probably likely that he sent somebody to post it. It was actually posted to the front door of the nearby church there, which is it's called All Saints Church today, but originally called the Wittenberg Church Castle in Wittenberg, Saxony, Germany. And he posted that where that door is right there. And today it's now engraved in the door, the 95 Theses. But they think the 95 Theses is, of course, the main thing that really starts the Reformation eventually. Primarily, it was about the issue of indulgences, but they think that it talked about other issues too. I think Luther felt like the church, like the Pope was too powerful, and that really the main authority on Christianity was not somebody in Rome, but actually the Bible itself overall. So anyway, so that's basically what Luther does with this particular 95 Theses. You'll see later he ends up getting condemned. He'll eventually get excommunicated. The Pope in the Catholic Church, which is Pope Leo X, will eventually excommunicate him. It's one of the main things that's going to occur because of the 95 Theses being published and all that. In fact, a lot of the tracts within the 95, I think up to 41 of them at one point will be actually censored by Pope Leo X, who was the Pope for I think 8 years at that time. And they actually give Luther 60 days to recant the actual what he wrote in the 95 Theses. And of course, later on, I think it also included later I think he ends up, if you know about this, sending him what they call the so-called papal bull, which I think I do have an image of that right here, which a papal bull is a type of letter that's usually written by the Pope and sent to people and this is the papal bull of June 1520, which is sometimes called Exsurge Domine, which supposedly means arise, O Lord. Yeah, rise, O Lord, or something like that is what it meant. And Luther decided that he basically decided to, criticize the Pope and go against him. And so because of this, Luther actually takes the actual papal bull in Wittenberg, Saxony, and burns it. I think the date was December 10th, 1520. Burns the papal bull. And I think there's today in Wittenberg, there's an oak tree which is on the site of where Luther actually burns it. If I could kind of share it with you, just right here. It's called the so-called Luther Reich or Luther Oak. I think was actually put there at that site 400 years after the date of when Luther died, which I think was the year, I want to say 1946, maybe in the year when they planted it. Luther died in 1546. And so that's the actual, they think the location or the spot where they think he burned it. So I guess you could say that may have been really when the Reformation started. It was right there in that spot when he actually burned it. So what's going to end up happening, this is going to eventually lead to a new religion forming, new Christian religion, Protestant type sect, the first Protestant one really to really start, which is Lutheranism. Lutheranism is, by the way, one of the largest Protestant sects in the world. Over 60 million people, of course, practice it today, not just in Europe, but all throughout the world, like in the Americas, Africa, Asia, wherever. And what happened was you had various German princes throughout Europe wanted to protect Luther and break away from the church. They started calling people that were Catholic Romanists because they felt like they were controlling everything from Rome. And so the term Lutheran is more of a term that Catholics called it, but they took it with a sense of pride, the name. And so the name Lutheran or Lutheran Church or Lutheranism kind of stuck, of course, after that. Of course, Luther would do away, with the Catholic Mass. I think they talked about how in that little short video, he starts to translate the Bible, like the New Testament, translating the German, things like that. They put more emphasis on studying the Bible and preaching and, doing songs and things like prayer songs and things like that overall. And so the word, like I said in the video, the word, Protestantism comes from the fact that they're protesting because of what the church was doing to Luther at that time. So, of course, now he's asking the question, the peasants disapprove of the selling of indulgences and see the problem with it. I think somewhat, a little bit with that too as well. I think they felt like Rome from afar was, trying to control everything and all that. A lot of them were the ones that got directly involved in it, quite a lot, especially those that even were involved in the radical movement, like the Radical Reformation and all that. Some even didn't like Luther either. That's the funny thing about it, because you have like these, I think there was some kind of peasants' revolt that happens right afterwards, about that. And they all start to revolt because the nobility control everything and all that throughout Europe. And so I think that's, part of it right there was just the people angry about the nobility and the upper classes having all the power, etc. But anyway, other things I did need to talk about too was like, what's the differences between, Lutheranism versus, Catholicism, which you can see here. Lutheranism, they put more emphasis on like faith in Jesus Christ. Like, so justification by faith alone is a big thing they talk about, whereas the Catholic faith is still in the faith, but they talk about good works and the sacraments and missionary work and things like that. So those are kind of a little different. Lutherans are more into studying the Bible, finding the truth about everything. Whereas, they study the Bible in Catholicism, but they also do more into the church teachings and things like that. Of course, Lutheranism rejected most of the sacraments of the Catholic Church. The only two they kept, you can see there, is baptism and communion. Baptism is called different things depending on what religion, I guess, you are, but communion was called different names like Lord's Supper or whatever as well. The local prince would rule over the church. So you had, church leaders or whatever that would rule over it versus the Catholic Church has the Pope in Rome, papal authority, etc. Lutheran Church, the priest can marry. That's something new to start doing. I'll talk about Luther, one of the first to marry, all that. And of course, in Catholic Church, the priests had to be celibate, as you know. Also, another big thing between the Lutheran and the Catholic Church was the whole issue of the communion thing, which you may have heard about. They had this thing called consubstantiation versus transubstantiation, which I did want to talk about, which was kind of a little different between the two. Luther had this thing called consubstantiation. He believed that the blood and wine went through a spiritual change whereby Christ is present, but the bread and the wine doesn't really transform. But in the Catholic Church, they think it did. I think it was a miracle that it did it. They call it transubstantiation. And so that was a big difference between the two on that issue. You wonder about that. Another thing about Luther and the Protestants, you ever heard of the solas, like the 5 solas, I think, or something that the Protestants create a lot too. It's a lot of them up there, but that's what they kind of created. The first one is sola scriptura, which is by scripture alone. So this belief that studying the Bible is important in salvation. Sola fide, by faith alone, by faith in Christ, etc. Sola gratia, by grace alone. Solus Christus, there's different versions of that, by Christ alone. Sola Deo Gloria, which is glory to God alone. I want to say Luther helped develop maybe the first 2 or whatever, but those other ones are kind of added later as well. So these are some of the differences, between, the Catholic faith and Lutheran faith, and other faiths would kind of break away and do different things too, as well. Now, another thing that happened too, which is very famous, they did give Luther a chance to recant, which is true about this. And so what happened was Luther met with the ruler of Germany, which his name was Emperor Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. This happened on April 18, 1521, at what they call the Diet of Worms, which the Diet of Worms was like the main kind of like assembly of the Holy Roman Empire, which Worms is in the western part of Germany today. It's an old city in Germany. Anyway, what happened, Luther was practically put on trial, but he refused to recant. And so what happened was the Emperor Charles V decided to issue what became known as the Edict of Worms. And what this edict did was it basically said that Luther was an outlaw, within the Holy Roman Empire, and that he could be maybe killed. Also, it banned a lot of his writings, like anything he published or whatever was banned. And a lot of Luther's ideas were spreading like wildfire, if you know about this, throughout Europe, because of, I don't know if I didn't talk about this earlier, but they think that the invention of the printing press by John Gutenberg back in the 15th century, the movable type printing press, had a lot to do with why the Reformation was spread so easily, because of information like that, printable books at the time. And so what happened was you had these rulers in Germany were not happy with what Holy Roman Empire was doing and the church. And so they had this ruler in Saxony. His name was Frederick the Wise, known as Frederick III, who was the Elector of Saxony. It's where Luther was living. He gave him sanctuary, so he couldn't be harmed or whatever. And so Luther came to this castle you're looking at right here, this picture, which is called Wartburg Castle. It's in Thuringia, Germany. And he was given kind of shelter there. And from there, he was able to begin translating the Bible, like the New Testament into German, things like that. And so that helped to kind of keep the movement going. So it's guys like this, man here you're looking at, Frederick III, Elector of Saxony, one of the first protesting princes, if you want. That's where the term kind of evolved from. We were also talking about how Luther got married. I think it was mentioned about that a little bit. He would actually marry this ex-nun in 1525 named Katharina von Bora. You see right there. And it's kind of an interesting story behind it. It happened like 2 years before. Apparently in 1523, Luther had helped 12 nuns escape from a convent. Because, the Lutherans wanted to close down the monasteries and the convents and all that. And so he was able to get 11 of the 12 women married, because Luther really believed that women ought to get married and things like that. And apparently he couldn't find a wife for Katharina von Bora. Right there you see. And so she came to him and suggested basically that they ought to get married. She asked him, by the way. And so, yeah, he did. And so they went on to have like several children, Martin Luther. And so Luther is, like I said, one of the first, I guess, priests or whatever to marry. And a bunch of other ones will kind of follow as well. So that's the story. That's the story of, Martin Luther and his background, how he started the Reformation, mostly in Germany, and then from Germany, of course, it's going to spread, through the rest of the world and all that, etc. All right, now I'm going to move on. I want to talk about next and get into. I want to move on. I need to talk about John Calvin, because you have this other brand of Protestantism that kind of takes off too, right after, called Calvinism. We'll kind of blow this up here, show it to you. But John Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564. Calvin was a French reformer. He was from, I think, Paris, France. I think his real name was actually Johann Colvin or Chauvin or something like that. And the English started calling him later John Calvin. And he helped to develop a lot of the principles of what would be so-called Calvinistic theology, which breaks up into various churches, which are sometimes called Reformed churches or Reformed Christianity, congregational churches. And they also have what they call the Presbyterian churches, which were big in Scotland, like the Church of Scotland, etc. And he's very famous for a book he published in 1536, which is called I think I've got a picture of it right here, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which I think he first published in Latin and French. And it spread popularly throughout Europe overall. And really, that book had more of an influence on any other, form of information that would create, Protestant sects and all that. I think a lot of people kind of consider it like the first textbook on how the Protestant religion kind of works, etc. And it influenced I'll get to it later, but it influenced John Knox and all that, and with the Church of Scotland. It influenced Anglicanism, like in England, and all that. And Calvinism had different beliefs they kind of, went into, which are kind of famous. I'll kind of talk about one of the most famous things, if you know about it, that the Calvinists kind of brought up as a new theology or ideology, I guess, was this idea of predestination, or some people call it predeterminism, which was this idea that God has already predetermined everything in the universe, like from the beginning to the end, and that all the souls of people, men, women, or whatever, are all destined to either go to heaven or to hell. So God already knows, when you're going to be born, what your name's going to be, who you're going to marry, what kind of children you're going to have, when you're going to die, whether you're going to go to heaven or hell, and all this. And so this is kind of stuff that they really started kind of pushing around in the 16th century. And we go back to the slide right here that had but where is it right here? They also believe in this idea that men and women, were born in sin, things like that. And they also believed that God had already saved certain people. I think they call it the so-called elect, a select group of people that are going to go to heaven and all that. And so Calvinism had really more of a bigger influence on Protestantism more than Lutheranism did. It really did, because it kind of created different variations of Christianity later. Oh, the other one they had was like the belief in religious theocracy, or this idea that people ought to be, some kind of church governance where they have church elders that run the state or the church itself. Like in Presbyterianism, they have like the presbyters or whatever that they got running the church and things like that as well. So that was something else that they, like I said, had an influence on. And later, he would go to, he actually fled France because the Catholics were more, had more power in France, obviously. And so a lot of the, I'll get to it later. The France is what they call the Huguenots, that are French Calvinists that are there. But Calvin would flee to Geneva, and he would help set up kind of like this religious theocracy in the country, and where religious leaders would have a lot of power. And they even had laws of the city, where people had to kind of live by that. And so you can see kind of examples there. Everyone had to attend religious class or go to church. You couldn't wear certain kinds of colors of clothes. You couldn't do certain kinds of things like gamble, play games, especially on Sunday. Like Sunday, you can't do things like sports and things like that. I think some people call this blue laws later or something like that. They dub them. But anyone that violates, these principles that you have to live by or whatever, you could be punished, like put in jail, fined. You could be excommunicated or banished. And I think there was even cases where some people were even put to death for not following, whatever laws or theology. So yeah, those are kind of something you see later. I know with the Puritans, like in England, the Puritans in colonial America, like Massachusetts. So that's the kind of stuff they pushed originally. He did influence, which is kind of, I didn't want to mention for just a few minutes on that, but they think that John Knox, who was Scottish, came to Switzerland, and he actually met John Calvin. And so he was so influenced by what, Calvin was doing, Calvinism and all that, that he decided to go back to Scotland and all that. And so he ended up creating their own Reformation in Scotland, which became later the so-called Church of Scotland. He's considered one of the founders of it. It's later called Presbyterianism, is what they call it, because of the fact that this particular church has a governance where it's run by these church elders that are called presbyters. So hence the name being used. They rejected the idea of using clerical officials like bishops and things like that, priests. They didn't want to do that. And Scots, of course, would later call it the Kirk, which means, I think, just the church, basically. And Knox and others in Scotland will try to, between the 16th, 17th centuries, they try to root out Catholicism, which is, I think most of Scotland at the time was Catholic, as you know. And so they'll try to basically turn it Protestant. So that's something he was kind of known for. That's their symbol on the right, which I think has Scottish flag, which I want to say it's a burning bush or something. That's what that symbol is. Then you have also another influence I did want to kind of move on. So Calvinism is like one of the big things that's, a branch of Protestantism. Now, they also got Zwingli, Ulrich Zwingli, who's real big in the Reformation as well. Zwingli was a Swiss reformer, in Switzerland, and he began making changes also to Christianity in what is mostly Zurich, Switzerland as a whole. He's kind of influenced by Luther and kind of follows what Luther's doing, like the whole, justification by faith alone. Zwingli even decided that, we have to do the same thing that the Lutherans are doing. We need to, close down the convents, monasteries. He also thought that the idea of clerical marriage was a good idea, and so he also would marry as well. And but his churches, like I said, were more puritanical. I think they were more in line with what John Calvin was really doing more than anything. And there's even a case where Luther and Calvin even met each other. They actually met. It's true about this. It happened in October of 1529. And at the time, I guess those were the two big Protestant reformers, like in Europe at the time. And so they met in this town called Marburg, in Germany, called the Marburg Colloquy. And apparently what the problem was between Luther and Zwingli was that they couldn't agree on how what the communion would be. This whole thing I talked about, transubstantiation versus consubstantiation, which, as you know, I think we talked about that before, what Luther was trying to push, if you remember correctly, was consubstantiation, right? Was the whole deal. And but the only thing was, I think if you study about Zwingli, he ends up saying that it's just symbolic, that it never really happened, the whole conversion thing, whatever. And so that was actually a conflict that helped to split Christianity even more overall in Protestantism. So we'll end up with all these different, Protestant sects that are there, which are still kind of sometimes splitting, I think, here and there, I guess. So you get later Methodists and others that kind of come along in the future. Then they had this other group that was called the Radical Reformers, or the so-called Radical Reformation. They nickname it sometimes. So-called Anabaptists appear, and a lot of the Anabaptists were Christians that basically didn't really like what the Catholics or the Protestants were doing, like Lutherans or the Calvins. And so they kind of broke away. They're considered more radical compared to what they were doing. They were known for a lot of different things. Like the Anabaptists were kind of like, they're almost like communists somewhat, like living in communes and things like that. And they wanted to abolish private property. But the thing that they're most famous for, the Anabaptists, they came up with new ideas on baptism. The main thing, as you know, was they created what they call a believer's baptism. This idea that one shouldn't really baptize until you know what you're doing as a Christian. Like you're an infant, you have no idea what you're doing. And so they rejected that idea. And so the word Anabaptist supposedly means to be baptized again, or rebaptizer. And so you get a lot of these groups like the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers were kind of influenced by that. I think some Baptists later were influenced by this idea, although the Baptists don't start till later. They're not at that time. And you can kind of see a map of where all the Anabaptists were. You can see most of them were in Germany, some were in Switzerland, right there. And I think even some of them get involved in that peasants' revolt they have in Europe, which a lot of peasants kind of revolt against the Catholic Church and the nobility and things like that. And so, yeah, but a lot of them were persecuted. They weren't respected. Many of them fled the country. Like the Amish Mennonites end up like in America and other countries because they're not given really religious rights for a long time. So that's another aspect of the Reformation they usually don't talk about, but it did happen. Then you got the English Reformation as well. The English Reformation is probably more famous, than, say, Zwingli or maybe even Calvin. And the English Reformation was something that happened in Tudor England in the 16th century. It happened under several monarchs. Primarily, the two main ones was King Henry VIII, and then also, don't forget, Queen Elizabeth I. There's some things that happened as well a little later. Of course, you can see Henry VIII right there. who lived from 1509. He actually reigned from 1509 to 1547 as the monarch of England. He, of course, is really famous. I think more, he's, famous for the English Reformation, but I think everybody's heard of his so-called, 6 Wives of Henry VIII. That's well known. Probably won't get into that today, but when I get more into the history of England, I'll talk about, what happened with that issue. But part of why he actually formed this new church, which will be the Church of England, is because of the fact that he wanted to annul his first marriage, who was to Catherine of Aragon, which is the one at the top left you're looking at. And apparently, Catherine of Aragon had only given him one surviving child, which was a daughter, which will later be Mary, Queen Mary, or Bloody Mary, as they call her later in England. And so he wanted a male heir. And so basically, he wanted to annul this first marriage to marry Anne Boleyn, who'll be his second wife later, have children. And so that's the whole reason why he'll actually create the church, mostly political dynastic reasons. And so in the 1530s, you get the Anglican Church or Church of England that's formed. And from there, you know about it, Henry just takes over this particular church. He literally just takes control of all the church's lands. He closes down the monasteries, the convents, and he also makes all the Catholic priests that are in England take an oath to him. And if they don't, he imprisoned them or even had them killed. And I think it was a case of Sir Thomas More, you may have heard of, who was a famous English Catholic priest. He refused to abide by his church and he was executed for it. So, yeah, he was pretty ruthless, Henry VIII. But he's the one that really starts the church. Although Anglicanism really starts out as this quasi-Catholic church with Henry at the head of it after he gets excommunicated by the Catholic Church. But over time, by the time of, I think, King Edward VI, his son, or whatever, comes in later, it'll become a Protestant church, and Bloody Mary tries to make it Catholic again. And then later, Queen Elizabeth I will eventually establish it as the main church and all that a little later. So that's basically, the English Reformation and what happened over there. So anyway, let me also talk about another thing that happened. One of the last things I'll get to today that's real important, and that is so there was a so-called Catholic Reformation that happened, which is called all kinds of names. They call it the Counter-Reformation is another name. They called it. Some people call it the Catholic Revival. Is what they call it sometimes. Yeah, the Catholic Revival. And the Catholic Church went through a period where they tried to basically conform to being, different. Otherwise, they were going to, get sold out by the Protestants they think people are leaving that and going to those churches, Lutheran, Calvin, or whatever. So they got to save this church. And so in 1545, the Pope at the time, you see in that picture at the top left in kind of red, Pope Paul III, he called the so-called Council of Trent, which was actually held from 1545 to 1563. The Council of Trent was this Catholic ecumenical council that was held in northern Italy. The city of Trent, or Trento, it's called in Italy. They met, you can see, over a period of like 18 years to try and make reforms. And the main thing they did was they wanted to reaffirm what the traditional Catholic views were going to be. I think at first there was a talk of maybe, talking with the Protestants or whatever to maybe try to fix things, but they decided not to do that, if you know about that. And so you get all these different major consequences of the Council of Trent where they begin to do different things with the church. And yeah, you can see that A and B there. Salvation comes through faith and good works. I think it was one thing they said where it wasn't just about salvation, the Bible, good works, things like that, following the sacraments, um, missionary work, things like that could lead to salvation and not just, faith alone or whatever. The Bible's still the major source of religious truth. But not the only source, obviously, because I believe that too. But these are things that they kind of either reforms or they kept within the church afterwards because of the Council of Trent overall. They kept all the 7 sacraments. So they didn't do like the Protestants, like Lutherans, just only had 2 of them, right? Communion, baptism. They kept those. They kept the veneration of the saints and the veneration of the Virgin Mary. They've been around forever, of course. They said that there would be only one Bible, which is the Vulgate Bible, which is the Latin-based Bible that went back to the time of St. Jerome, who had translated it in ancient times. They also talked about the fact that the Mass would be in Latin. So the Tridentine Mass, they call it for years. They go up to I want to say the 1960s and 70s. They used. They also developed, which is true, they helped develop the Roman Catechism, which was basically a bunch of teachings to help priests, lay people learn what the teachings of the church is and the prayers and things like that. They created that because the Protestants were creating their own catechism, which is kind of a problem. So they did that. They created seminaries and schools to educate priests, educate Catholics. That was something they did. They did ban indulgences, which was banned in 1567, which is true about that. And the Catholic Church also did this thing called the Roman Inquisition, where they could have a trial where they could bring you up for heresy. Where the church could condemn you and things like that. I think Galileo got caught up in that. I know in Italy as an example. And so that was kind of an extension of the whole medieval Inquisition that's kind of been around, going back to those days. They even had this deal, which is very interesting, that the Council of Trent helped create. They had a ban on various books, the so-called list of prohibited books. So works they thought that were heretical, that were a threat to the Catholic faith, you couldn't read them if you were Catholic. I think the Latin name was Index Librorum Prohibitorum, that's what it's called. And it banned a lot of different authors up to the 1960s. Seriously, for a long, long time. Basically for what is over 400 years. They banned people from reading certain books. They include authors like Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Galileo, Rousseau, Copernicus, Francis Bacon, Immanuel Kant, Rene Descartes, John Locke. All those kind of people, authors, whatever, were banned from reading. There's other ones too, but those are probably the most famous ones. Surprisingly, who they didn't ban? Charles Darwin. Believe it or not. So, that's kind of weird. Seems like he would have been banned, but he wasn't. Because a lot of the scientists, I think Copernicus, Galileo, the early ones like that, were actually banned at one point. Then they had the Jesuits. They also kind of was something that formed during the whole Catholic Reformation as well. The Jesuits was often called for short the Society of Jesus. And some people call it the Soldiers of Christ if you want, kind of a nickname. But this was a Catholic order of priests that was founded by several priests. One of the most famous is Ignatius of Loyola, who was a former Spanish soldier who had gotten wounded. And so Loyola created this order, and he also became its first leader, which the leader of the Jesuits is called a superior general. And he wrote this book that was called The Spiritual Exercises, which was published in the 16th century. And he had 2 other men, I think it was Peter Faber and also St. Francis Xavier. They were instrumental in developing this order of priests. And why are the Jesuits important? Well, the Jesuits are important because of the fact that they were kind of like the frontline priests, I guess, trying to, stop the spread of Protestantism. They helps set up churches, schools, seminaries, to educate priests and things like that, and Catholic people. So they're never, creating schools and universities. They did a lot of missionary work too. Like they would travel to different parts of the world, Africa, the Americas, Asia, trying to convert people. And a lot of people were scared of them. Like they were known for wearing these, black looking robes. Like some people call it black robe, I think was the kind of nickname I think they use in the America, especially the Native Americans, I think call them black robe sometimes, I know. But they set up a lot of universities, like Loyola University and all these other universities you've probably heard of. Xavier had a bunch of schools too. He set up things like that. So they're pretty important in the whole Counter-Reformation against, the Protestants and all that. They also I do want to mention something that's true. They had this other order that kind of came about because of the Catholic Reformation, which is the Order of St. Ursula, you may have heard of, called the Ursulines. It's founded in 1572, and that was a order of nuns that was mostly involved in developing like convents, schools for Catholic girls. And I think that building you're looking at there is the Ursuline Academy in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's like one of the oldest school for girls, I think, in the South. And it was founded in 1727. So I think there's some other ones too that are older than that in, I think, the northern part of the United States. But they were involved in that and educating Catholic girls and, maintaining convents and things like that. Another thing I usually kind of mention about, which is kind of true, which is part of the whole Reformation, especially up to like the 30 Years' War, you get this craze in Europe where witches are hunted down. Like Europe, and even happened in North America, as you know, like the Salem witch trials that happened in the late 17th century, etc. But they think between about the 15th to the 18th centuries, there was a period where people hunted after witches, tried to root them out. It went back to the Middle Ages, like going back to like the Black Death. Then I think it peaked pretty much in the Reformation, and even during the 30 Years' War, like in Germany, they were trying to kill witches. These say 100,000 or more may have been killed at one point, but I think they say the estimated conservative amount that may have been killed the most was maybe 40 to 50,000. Might be it. You can see that the state that had the most killed was Germany, especially I know around during the 30 Years' War. There were a lot that were killed. And Switzerland, had a good amount too. France, Scotland. Scotland had a pretty good amount. It's interesting about that. I think up to King James, there was even a case where people were being executed for being witches and all that. And what helped spawn it was the fact that they had these manuals out there that you could read on how to hunt for witches. You may have heard of the famous book that was called Hammer of Witches, written by this German witch hunter himself named Heinrich Kramer back in the 15th century. Malus Maleficarum, I think is the Latin name. And so it taught you how to basically hunt for witches and put them on trial and do tests on them and things like that. And so that became like an obsession. And I know women were the main target of mostly those that would be accused of being witches, and then some men as well. Of course, it led to a lot of people being tortured. In fact, a lot of people said they were witch because the fact they were being tortured. They wanted to get it over with. So I'm a witch, whatever. And so you can see different methods they would use. Like the top left, the breast ripper, where they would rip women's breasts, things like that. They'd put you on a wheel or a rack. You see the top right, the wheel, I guess. The thumb screw, where they would basically screw and crush your fingers or your toes. They, of course, burn you at the stake and other things like that. So in many different ways that they would, torture people, things like that. But yeah, the witch hunt craze eventually it declined. I think after the 30 Years' War, but they do think it was a big part of the Reformation for sure, because people were really, like I said, obsessed with hunting witches down. So that's something you don't really think much about, with the Reformation. But people. I think it was even a case where Catholics would accuse the Protestants, or Protestants accuse each other of being witches because their religions were so different from each other, things like that. So anyway, this is, of course, my part one lecture today. I think probably going to stop here today. Later in the week on Wednesday, I'll get more into the rest of the Reformation. I'm going to talk also about what happens with Germany. Germany's going to come up with this thing called the Peace of Augsburg to prevent bloodshed between Catholics and Lutherans. They'll have that happen. In France, they'll have the French Wars of Religion that will occur as well. And that'll force the French to create what they call the Edict of Nantes to give, French Protestants religious rights to prevent civil war and all that. Then I'll also get into, and I'll talk about the 30 Years' War. That's going to be the main pivotal thing I'll talk about on Wednesday. But I'll talk about how in Germany, it just explodes. The difference between the Catholics and the Protestants. And you have the Civil War that kind of even involves other countries that are all around it. And so that ends up being the peak major event, of the whole Reformation. So that's it for today. Like I said, if you have any comments, questions about this, lecture, you can always let me know later. Not sure what Christian was talking about, but yeah, that's kind of where a lot of it comes from, because from the Reformation, especially with the Protestant sects, it kind of develops like around the 16th century and all that. But I will see y'all later in the week. Don't forget, if you haven't sent me your contract policy page, send that to me or post it in Canvas and all that. But I'll send out announcements coming up, of course, about the lecture on Wednesday. We will be having a quiz coming up too, which will be on the Reformation later in the week. So yeah, now y'all take care and have a great, of course, rest of the week. First 2 weeks of school and all that. So y'all take care. I'll see y'all later.